If you're going on a hike in California, take a look for wild grapevines. They're pretty commonly found anywhere there's running water. In California, we have two endemic species, and there are many, many more across the United States. Vitis riparia actually became a rootstock, which we see all over the place. Riparia means riparian, which means it grows better near water. Vitis rupestris is also a rootstock, and we commonly call that St. George. There are many different species of grapevine, and you'll find them as you're hiking around in nature. So now let's go on a hike to go find some wild grapevines.
Today I'm looking for wild grapevines because they play an instrumental role in growing grapes worldwide. Because of their place in vineyards, we can't underestimate the importance of wild grapevines to viticulture as a whole. In the late 1800s, a nasty, aphid-like pest, now known as grapevine phylloxera, hitched a ride from the Americas to Europe. It quickly became a cause for concern across the continent, rapidly killing off vineyards through its feeding damage. During this time period in Europe, Vitis vinifera was grown on its own roots. However, vinifera was not adapted to the feeding damage of phylloxera. Luckily, wild grapevines native to the Americas were, and viticulturalists soon learned that grafting a rootstock onto vinifera helped reduce the impacts of phylloxera outbreaks. Today we have hundreds of grapevine rootstock varieties whose uses go beyond the protection of vinifera scions from phylloxera. There are now rootstocks we use to combat drought, salinity, other pests, and to control scion vigor. It's often the case that more than one rootstock cultivar will perform well on a given site. However, you want to avoid choosing one that will not perform well. When selecting a rootstock for your site, it's better to focus on not choosing the wrong one, rather than always trying to pick the best one.
When establishing a vineyard, it's important to make note of your rootstock choice. So different rootstocks have different levels of vigor. You can see that one was very weak, and this one is much stronger but diseased. And this is also true for the scions. The scions and the rootstocks have inherent levels of vigor. It also depends on where you are and what the conditions are of the region that you're in. But growing a monster like this may not be all that beneficial to you because you're having all this extra wood and extra space along with a bunch of suckers that you just have to manage, not leaving room for other younger vines to grow and prosper. This rootstock behind me is actually very vigorous, and you can tell. The choice of scion also matters here because more vigorous scions like Sauvignon Blanc will benefit from a less vigorous rootstock, whereas a less vigorous scion would benefit from a more vigorous rootstock. If you can see over here, these grapevines and the ones we just passed are less vigorous. The ones we saw previously over on this side are actually much more vigorous, and you can see how much thicker these are than the ones we see behind us.
When choosing a support trellis system for your vineyard, growers have many options. Each type of trellis has its pros and cons, but choosing the right one for your site and style of vineyard management is important. As with most endeavors, when establishing a vineyard, it's important to set your goals before you begin. Know your site, its climate, weather patterns, water availability, soil health, and so on. Then you would want to focus on canopy development for as much photosynthetic leaf tissue as your vine can support on that site. Trellis type will impact this a lot. Know the amount of sunlight the vineyard would get, and choose a trellis system that increases bud exposure to that light. Buds on shoots that were shaded when developing tend to be less vigorous the following year. Similarly, increasing sun exposure on the fruit helps promote ripening and good berry characteristics, but too much can cause sun damage on the grapes. Make sure your fruit is distributed as equally as possible across the whole vine. Grape clusters are large and need enough room to grow without bumping into their neighbors. Improving air movement in the leaf's canopy is good for reducing fungal infections. Fungi don't enjoy open, windswept environments, but proliferate in humid, shady environments. Improving air movement is also good for any pesticides you may spray, as they will penetrate deeper into the canopy. Also consider if you want to mechanize any aspect of the vineyard before deciding on a trellis system. There are many considerations you should account for when selecting a trellis type. but we'll go through a few of the most important now. Capacity. Is the site high or low vigor? We'll likely want to choose a trellis system that imparts the opposite of the site. Viticultural goals. Do we want to reduce or encourage vigor? Again, this depends on the site and vine choice. Fruiting zone. Do we benefit more from increasing light or reducing heat? Take note of the amount of sun exposure your site gets in a day. Row and vine spacing. Would we benefit from a trellis system that packs in more vines? The cultivar and rootstock. How will the rootstock affect vigor? Rootstock scion combinations are a whole science. Ask advisors or experts if you aren't sure. Economics. Trellis construction and labor costs are important to note before the installation begins. Mechanization. Do we need a system that is easily adaptable to machine harvesting and pruning? Most hobby grape growers will not. In California, there are a few very common trellis designs for wine grapes. Vertical shoot position, or VSP, California sprawl, lyre, Y, or no trellis. No trellis vines are head train vines that look like small trees. So let's go through each of these and determine what site calls for each. A vertical shoot position, or VSP trellis, is a bilateral system with two cordons. It's designed to support the shoots of the grapevine vertically. Often shoots are tucked into a wire to keep them vertical, and this is one of the most common trellis designs in California and provides good light exposure and airflow to the fruiting zone. It's also easily mechanized for a number of practices, including harvest, pruning, suckering, and more. However, the early season labor is extensive and can be costly. Fruit can also receive too much light in this system and become sunburned. California sprawl is another bilateral trellis design that allows the shoots to weep over the canopy and provide natural shading to the fruit zone. This helps reduce the chances of sun-damaged fruit that we often find in a VSP system. California sprawl systems still sport good airflow in the fruit zone and enough light exposure to fully ripen fruit. However, the cane's growth will decline as they begin to weep over and may offer too much shade in some pockets. This can slow fruit ripening when compared with a VSP. It is mechanizable, but mechanization is not as straightforward as in a VSP system. A lyre trellis system is a quadrilateral system with 4 cordons and vertical shoots. It can be thought of as 2 VSP systems on a single vine and has high vigor and potential for high yield. Grapevines with vertical shoots tend to grow more than grapevines with shoots that weep over. This system is great when you have a more vigorous rootstock scion combination or a site with high growth potential. However, these can be difficult to mechanize and expensive to install. They require more materials up front and more labor for training the vines to the trellis than the bilateral systems we just saw. The Y trellis is also a quadrilateral system and is designed like 2 California sprawls on one vine. Similar to the lyre trellis, one vine is trained to have 4 cordons. However, once they are long enough, the shoots are allowed to weep over the canopy rather than be positioned vertically. The Y trellis has the benefit of shading the fruit zone and moderating vine vigor, but can also be difficult to mechanize. They are also prone to damage by high winds due to their sail-like vine architecture. If you don't want to spend the time and money to put in wires, you may choose to have no trellis at all. The head train spur prune system allows the vine to stand upright with only one support post. When mature, vines trained like this have a resemblance to small trees. This system is highly cost-effective and easy to establish and maintain. However, it can result in a lower fruiting capacity because it is devigorating to the vine. Fruit can also ripen at different times based on their height from the ground. Overall, when you're selecting a trellis, you want to make sure you answer a few key questions about your setup. First, what is the potential vigor of the site? High vigor sites tend to have healthier soils with good drainage, but still have decent water holding capacity. On more vigorous sites, a larger system, such as a lyre or a Y, may be beneficial to help balance out the vine's vigor with the site's potential, and the opposite is true for a less vigorous site. Which way is your site facing? This is called the aspect, and southern and western facing sites often get more sun exposure and higher temperatures in California. You want to make sure to avoid too much sun exposure on the fruit. A weeping cane trellis might help here, such as a California sprawl or a Y. How windy does it get? One of the most disappointing events for a grower is the collapse of an entire row. Avoid this by choosing a trellis with good airflow, such as a VSP or lyre. Avoid a Y trellis system in windy areas. Do you want to mechanize any aspect of your vineyard management? For hobby grape growers, this shouldn't be the case, but if you want to mechanize pruning, suckering, or harvesting, make sure your trellis system is compatible with existing farm equipment. Before you decide on a trellis system, make sure to weigh all your options and consult an expert if you're in doubt or have questions.
Row and vine spacing are important aspects to consider when planting a small vineyard. These vines are spaced about 6 feet apart and about 8 feet between rows. For each vine, you have two sides of a cordon here, so this is a bilateral cordon. And each part of this cordon, so this side and this side, are about 3 feet long. That ensures that all the space on the wire between the vines are filled by cordons and fruiting canes. This will increase your productivity as much as possible.
Sourcing vines for planting is an important factor in the health and longevity of your vineyard. Healthy vines will live longer and be more productive than vines that were diseased when they were planted. No matter what kind of grapevine you plant, it should be grafted to a grapevine phylloxera-resistant rootstock. This is essential to ensure your vine survives the feeding of phylloxera on its roots. Choosing a rootstock is an important process and should be based on your local climate and the vigor potential of your soils. Please see UC ANR's Grapevine Varieties in California publication for some good recommendations. When choosing a scion, it's important to note the temperature index of your region. Some scions are better adjusted to heat, while others prefer cooler, foggy climates. However, this often comes down to personal preferences of the grower. Grapevine starters can be purchased in a few forms, but the two most common are green growers and dormant planters. Green growers are actively growing seedlings and require water immediately when planting. Dormants are often hardier, but still require water after planting. Whatever you decide, make sure you purchase certified virus-free stock when planting a vineyard. This will help prevent vine decline from diseases that began outside of your vineyard and were carried in with new plantings. Foundation Plant Services sells certified virus-free stock.
A great way to protect young vines you just planted from herbivore feeding or pesticide damage is to use tree cones or protective cones. You place these around the newly planted vine, and not only do they protect the vine, they provide support for a young vine to grow upright. Well, we're at the top of the mountain and we didn't find any wild grapes, but we did find a vineyard behind us on the top of a hill. It's a good time to talk about slope and when it's okay to plant on a slope and when you should think twice about it. So we're at the very top of this mountain, and we hiked all the way up here looking for wild grapevines, and we didn't find any, but we did find a great view, and we also found a vineyard at the very top of this mountain. And this vineyard brings up a lot of questions, like how do they get equipment up here? But it's also a really good time to talk about slope and when not to plant on a slope. If you can see, these vines are actually head trained and cane pruned, which is a devigorating system, and that's good for cooler regions and cooler areas. As we're on top of a mountain, that would make sense because in the early morning, this probably gets very cold up here. But in the afternoon and evening, when the sun is hitting them directly, they're getting a lot of sunlight because they're on top of a hill. There's nothing to shade them. And when they get all that sunlight with the cane pruning system, the fruit's getting a lot of that sunlight too. That's great for fruit ripening, but it's also a risk for sun damage on the fruit. So this vineyard is planted on a slope. If we were to look over this way more, it goes actually very steeply downhill, probably more than a 5% grade. And that might be problematic, or at least they needed permits to do that, because once you hit over 5% grade, you have to consider soil erosion as a factor. Soil erosion is one of the big concerns that we have in agriculture as a whole. We want to maintain our soils. We want to make sure that our soils last for generations and not just one generation. And to ensure that that happens, we need regulation on where we can plant things, how we can plant things, and when we can plant things. And this is true in grapes too. Planting a vineyard on top of a mountain like this, while beautiful, has its fair share of challenges. Not only erosion control and ease of access are of concern, but also frost damage is something you have to consider on an annual basis. Does it get colder on top of the mountain? Most likely. Are you going to have to worry about frost more often? It's possible. All right, that's it for the vineyard on the mountain. We're going to go back down the hill, and I'll see you at the next video.